Here's to the crazy ones. The misfits. The rebels. The troublemakers. The round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
And a few years later, together, they achieved that dream and released the Apple II. The Apple II was a revolutionary computer, and it was the first computer ever to have a 5.5-inch floppy disk drive. Who remembers those? That is old school. And right from the start of the Apple organization, right from its birth, one of the key themes of Apple is that they are pioneers. They want to break through and to start new things. So that is the first key theme about Apple. After the Apple II was released, Apple went from strength to strength. And in 1980, it became a PLC. And in doing so, it instantly created more millionaires than any other company had done before. Overnight, when it became a PLC, over 300 shareholders instantly became millionaires. Apple was a thriving company. And Steve Jobs, who is the CEO, was desperate for Apple to get better, and he knew he had to get the best of the best. One of those best of the best was a man called John Sculley. John Sculley was the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, and in a now famous meeting, Steve Jobs turned to John Sculley, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "You can sell that sugared water for the rest of your life, or you can come with me and change the world." Needless to say, in John Sculley's life, Pepsi was replaced by Apple. The second key theme is that Apple are all about changing the world. That's what that first advert was about. It was an Apple advert. Steve Jobs was desperate to change the world through computers and through machinery. And the Jobs and Sculley partnership got off to a flyer. In 1984, they released a new computer called the Macintosh computer. And it was the first computer ever to have a mouse with it, which was a little plastic box with a wire round to the back. It enabled you to control the user face instead of using the type that you would normally use for a computer. It was released in 1984 with a groundbreaking advert directed by Ridley Scott, and it was based on George Orwell's book called 1984, and it was all built around how 1984 won't be like 1984. And if you've read the book, you'll understand that. I, however, haven't. But the Macintosh wasn't entirely a success. Sales prices were huge. It was quite expensive to buy, and the figures that came back were less than 50% of what they predicted. So Apple began to struggle, and the stock prices began to fall, and there was infighting between the company. The board wanted Sculley to rein Jobs in, because Jobs was desperate for the company to grow, to innovate more, to try new things, and the board just wanted to save money. And in a famous board meeting where it all came to a head, Jobs turned to the board and said, "It's me or him." And the board chose him, and Steve Jobs was fired. So under John Sculley, Apple began to produce new things. They started to produce PDAs, they started to produce printers, they started to produce all different sorts of cameras. But none of them took off. None of them were a huge success in the market, and Apple was floundering. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs had severed all ties with Apple apart from one single share. He then set up a new company called Next, which was about building computers, high-end, high-spec computers. And these computers were expensive to buy and didn't really take off. However, the next computer had a huge role to play in the formation of the World Wide Web, what we know as the internet. Jobs also invested in a small Hollywood company called Pixar. And in 1995, Pixar produced a film called Toy Story, which changed the way we watch movies forever. So while Apple was floundering, Steve Jobs was flying, and Apple realized that they had lost their core. It's good, isn't it? And in 1998, Apple bought out Next, and Steve Jobs returned to Apple. And it was like the prodigal son coming home. Jobs was absolutely buzzing. He sat the team down and he said, why are we bothering with cameras? Why are we bothering with printers? Why are we bothering with PDAs? We are not good at these things. Let's focus on what we're good at. We are good at computers, so let's be great at computers. The third key theme is Apple are about quality, not quantity. In 1998, a year after Jobs had returned to the company, Apple released their new computer, the iMac. And Steve Jobs was quoted in interviews as saying, it looks so good, you just want to lick it. And to be honest, it does look good, but maybe not that good. In just under 4 months, it sold over 800,000 copies, and Apple was back. The computer, the iMac, was built as the computer that tamed the complexity of computing. To me and you, it was a computer that was understandable for mere mortals. And that brings me on to key theme number 4. They had a clear vision. Make it simple and make it look good. And under this new, clear vision, it was the dawn of a new age. Apple then went on to create iPods, to create iPhones, and to create iPads, all under that same vision. And Jobs was a man that loved quoting a man called Henry Ford, who invented the motor car. And one of the famous quotes by Henry Ford was that if I'd have built what people wanted, I'd have built a faster horse. And Steve Jobs was famous for not listening to his consumers. In fact, early on when he returned to the company, one of the first things that he did was that he sacked his entire marketing company. And he said, I don't care what people want because they don't know what they want. We're not going to give them what they want. We're going to tell them what they need. And one of the things I love about Apple is that they are innovative, that they're not just trying to build the next something, they're not trying to build a newer version of something else, but they're innovating, they're trying to come up with something fresh and something new. 5 years ago, if you'd have offered me an iPad, I'd have said, what the heck is that? Is that a big phone? And then suddenly Apple brought out the iPad and everybody wants one. Leon wants one as well and he's got one. But companies have followed suit. Samsung, Sony have brought out similar versions of it, and Apple have created a new market. If you hadn't guessed it by now, I quite like Apple. I think Apple is a fantastic organisation. I think it's a brilliant organisation. But I don't think it's as good as the church. See, the answer for this broken and lost nation, world, is not fantastic computers. It is a church on the move. It is a church on the rise. It is the kingdom of God stepping up and taking responsibility and loving the communities. But I think we can learn a lot from Apple. I've given you a short presentation on the history of Apple. I'm going to ask you a question. What can the church learn from Apple?